witch.
The devil. Simply mentioning the name might conjure the form of a red goat man with a trident, horns, and maybe a serpent's tail. But how did the devil get this look? One might be forgiven for assuming that the Bible would describe the devil in this way, when in fact it most certainly doesn't describe the devil really whatsoever, other than taking the form of a serpent and a dragon in Revelations. But asking how the devil came to appear this way isn't just a matter of his image, it's also a matter of how the idea of the devil has been changed and has morphed across the expanse of time. How did the devil come to have the characteristics that we assume of him, and how did the devil come to appear in the variant ways that the devil has come to appear? There are answers to all of these questions. Interestingly enough, we're not going to find our answers in the Bible here. We're going to find our answers through an amalgam of theological and cultural history. So, with that said, let's track the historical development of the devil. Naturally, we have to begin the story with the Bible first being disseminated. Immediately, two things need to be addressed. One is the interpretation of this text. How do we come to some sort of consensus? And two, how do we deal with the pagans? How do we deal with the people? That is what pagans mean. Everybody other than us, who in this day and age have the status quo completely. So, firstly, in regards to gaining a consensus on the devil, the Bible itself is quite confused in regards to this account. It leaves a lot for interpretation. What the devil means, what his role is, when is he there and when is he not? Is he the serpent in the garden? Is he Lucifer? All of this will be put to rest. Instead of further investigating the question, we need instead to come to a consensus, and that consensus is that Lucifer is the devil. He is a fallen angel in a hubristic attempt to revolt against God, was sent down below, tried to become independent of God, and runs hell. For better or for worse, this is the interpretation. This is the consensus that will move through time. To gain perspective on how this develops, we're going to quote and give a synthesis of the ideas expressed by early church fathers. And in this, we're going to start with roughly 160 AD, where we can find this quote: "For fearing the Lord, you will have dominion over the devil, for there is no power in him." This gives the impression that the devil is irrelevant, even though he has been casted in the role of the stark antagonist. That is not the focus, which gives us an interesting window into how there isn't much of a separation between the Jewish interpretation of greater Abrahamic religion and Christian early on. And by that I mean, in Judaism, a interpretation of the works is that all the rest is irrelevant other than seeking God. One ought not ask about the afterlife. One ought not seek certain aims except for following God. And so in this respect, early Christian fathers would say the devil is effectively irrelevant. To further the nuance of this early mentality, Origen, an infamous early church father, would point out how the devil and demons were introduced, yet the Bible and the church, by extension, have not, with any reasonable clarity, explained how they exist and what they're on about. So, this point of wonder, this point of questioning, is what is ultimately going to answer our two introductory questions. How do we make a consensus about the devil, and what do we do in regards to the pagans? And even as early as 200, the ideas start to be kicked up. For instance, demons are connected with idols, statues, mediums, oracles, and astrological signs. So this is where the demonization begins, roughly. But this is still such an amorphous and undecided time that other ways of thinking are still readily in the mix, and this is Gnosticism. Whether mainstream Christianity would ever acknowledge it or not, Gnosticism will contribute much in the way of the fundamental thought of later mainstream Christianity. In these early Gnostic texts, we can see how the devil is given agency over the material world. For instance, in a letter to Barnabas, this is early 2nd century, the devil is the one who is entrusted with the administration of matter and its forms of appearance. This way of thinking, this dichotomy, this separation between God being that of which is immaterial, that of which is of the spirit, and the devil, that of which rules the material world, all the sensual pleasures, the wealth, the riches, all of these things are of the evil one. This idea, this premise, will grow dramatically in the future and will become painfully relevant to our later characterization of the devil. So, roughly 100 years later, we continue this what is of the devil trope. It is a mandate, a prohibition is given out that the priests shall not practice magic, enchantment, astrology, or math. Now, this might seem harsh, but the intention here is what should be minded. We are going to give these overzealous mandates in order to be able to prosecute actions of which we deem to be immoral or unfit. This is a sharp line, a boundary being established to help distinguish what is Christian and what isn't Christian. So it has to be stark. It has to be dramatic. It's not as though these priests can't do 1 + 1 = 2, but if they see that somebody is giving too much in the way of Neoplatonic philosophy or too much in the way of the, let's just say, scholastic as opposed to the religious, these would be red flags that they'd want to be able to tend to right away. Magic as a prohibition is quite strange because much of the religious act in any religion is magical. If I am to pray, this is a magical act. However, this is the beginning of making a line between that which is Christian sanctioned ways of relating to divinity and pagan ways of relating to divinity. Roughly during this time, around 350, a church father introduces the idea of using the cross to expel demons. So, curiously, this trope, that of which we'd see in exorcism movies or in horror, is roughly 1700 years old. During the same time and on this same subject, there are also certain exorcism oils that are being prescribed. Now, this is a bit of a blemish on this part of early Christian history, in that herbology is still very much being practiced, and this herbology would readily and with great fervor later be understood as witchcraft. So the experimentation and the puberty of this ensuing institutionalization is still very much in the mix. And now we have another influence from a very different interpreter of the Bible, and that's Mani, or Manichaeism. And in the same way as Gnosticism is contributing to this story, so will Manichaeism, in more ways than will be referenced in this session. But this specific relationship between the demonic or the evil one and sexuality will be completely handed over by Manichaeism. So, this much later form of, say, Puritan sexual ethos is rooted in a different religion, a wholesale different interpretation of the Bible. But you can see how this tie is made, in that the devil is now being understood as that which rules the material world. Sexuality is also being understood as something rooted in the material world, and thus sexuality is that of the evil one. The sensual pleasures are that of Satan, the evil one. This taboo survives us. We are still reacting to this taboo, whether it's a harsh aversion to nudity or a harsh aversion to variant sexual practices. This will stand the test of time. So here, as early as the 300s, the devil is now being associated with sexuality. Moving forward in time, looking at the years of roughly 400 to 700, we should acknowledge the Byzantine Empire and its influence on this part of the story, in that the devil here is understood in a fundamentally other kind of way. Byzantium was influenced by Neoplatonism and was much more philosophically inclined. Accordingly, the idea of God was understood often through negative theology, through mysticism. So if God is this sort of universality or wholeness or all-encompassing being, then the devil, by virtue of being its opposite, would be a vacuous non-entity state of being. And accordingly, we really wouldn't have much to say or to anthropomorphize. But nonetheless, we get our alleged first depiction of the devil in this era and in this area. The devil appears blue, much more in that Lucifer angel form. And there's a lot to deconstruct from this depiction. For one, the choice of the devil being blue is more of a lower air sort of reference, as opposed to the ether or the upper air reference. The upper air, or that which is holy, would have been red. That's why the angels in the Old Testament especially are on fire. So much is on fire, these chariots of fire. This older understanding of that which burns as a purification as well is in the mix. So the depiction of red is still holy, or is still that of the heaven or the higher spirits and the angelic. So him being depicted as blue, the devil being depicted as blue, is actually a statement of lesser, and isn't putting him in the ground, in hell, is just saying it's of lower air. And in this early depiction, we see lambs on one side and we see goats on the other. And right in front of Satan is the goat. We'll be getting into this more later, but I want to paint a picture of the broader landscape here. The devil and his influence or his personification is a question of where and when, especially at this point. But there is a growing, more general sentimentality where everything that we don't understand is the devil. Anything that is not easily attributed to or enters the unknown of our minds is the devil. And this survives us in our geography. Let me just name some geological formations in the state and let me know if you see a theme. There's Devil's Den, Devil's Kitchen, Devil's Garden, Devil's Tea Table, Devil's Post Pile, Devil's Cup, Devil's Bathtub, Devil's Daring Needle Hollow, Devil's Thumb, Devil's Punch Bowl, Devil's Tower, so on. A very short list. The devil's presence has been developing. His presence in all material things, his presence surrounding us on all fronts, the devil not being any longer depicted as envious, but now being depicted as prideful, gains steam. And this evil as a mere absence of good isn't good enough anymore. Evil is now a monolithic force, all encompassing. This is the growing narrative. And so by the time that we reach the full breadth of the Middle Ages, this fervor is vivid and visceral and collective. You might ask why, and yes, it is nuanced. We could talk about a number of cultural developments that have substantiated this, but the big one to acknowledge is Christianity's greater empowerment, institutionalization, and the reach of Christianization. How powerful fear is as a tool, especially for people who are uneducated. And this development, with a certain leaning of the mind, could be explained as simply a tool. The devil is now going to be characterized, made anthropomorphic as a tool. But we have to start deciding what that looks like, what it should look like, what we're going to pull from, and how this depiction can be advantageous for us. So let's start talking about the image and how it develops. The 11th century seems to be where this all gets started. And initially, the depictions are of a black imp, almost like a little goblin or a little troll. And slowly, these depictions start to get more and more grotesque, but there's still some variety. Sometimes the devil's an old man or simply a misshapen creature, or sometimes the devil now has horns and is nearly naked, utilizing that association with both the wild and sexuality. And then after the goat characteristics come in, comes the tail, and then comes the pitchfork. But why? How? How did all these things come about? How were they decided? And we're going to tend to them one by one. Some are very easy, and some are going to take more elaboration. One that's very easy is why the devil sometimes has this pointy tail. Like I mentioned previously in the session, one of the few depictions of the devil in the Bible is when he is the great red dragon in Revelations. Quote, "His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth." So this tail is especially notable, and this seems to be a direct rip from the Bible. Another relatively easy one, accordingly, is the red skin, as it's been decidedly depicted. This red skin as a reference to Revelations, again, the great red dragon, or more colloquially, it's understood that this is hell-ish, that the burning fires of hell is thus red. It's not very clever, but hey. But red is also understood as bestial, like blood. And this carnal sexual attribute is very devilish as the idea has developed. But what is more complicated and what deserves much more elaboration is the goat attribute in tandem with the pitchfork and the beard. The goat attribution is easily the most layered and offers up several ways of explaining, interpreting it. There are simpler ways and there are more elaborate ways. A simpler way of interpreting it is if Jesus has an association with the lamb, then the opposite would be the goat. Such would be hinted at by that depiction from the Byzantine Empire earlier. This antithetical nature between Jesus and Satan. The other explanation is previously mentioned in the course, and that is the devil's potential association with Capricorn. This having to do with astrotheology and where the planets are in the solar system. This is relevant because of the associations between the planets and these characters. This sun, which is beneficence, feeds the earth, is enlightenment, is good, is Jesus. There are plenty of allegories that give Jesus a sun attribution. The opposite side of us, further away from the sun, is Saturn, or the antagonist. We are halfway between Saturn and the sun in this way of thinking. And so this is a perfectly good embodiment, representation of how Christianity positions humanity between the wholeness and the enlightenment and the beneficence of the sun and the suffering Saturnine qualities of Saturn. Now, in the calendar, August is Leo season, that of which is associated with the sun. The opposite time of year is January, which is Capricorn, which is Saturn season. So there it is. These are the times of year given to each of those attributions. One is the lion and the other is the goat. And the goat, thus, has these attributions, is thus given to the devil. But the more layered explanation is the Christianization or the assimilation of paganism. Here we have to acknowledge the Greek god Pan, who takes the form of a satyr, a half goat, half man. This chimeric kind of hybrid quality is very common in the Greek mythos. You have the centaurs, you have the minotaur. The goat here simply symbolizes the wild, and again, that of which is unknown, that of the wilderness, that of the material world, is the devil and is evil. But in the case of observing Pan from his original mythos, this is a fertility deity. Yes, accordingly associated with sexuality. This fertility, though, is of nature and of the land. So much of this propagates. The grass regrows every year. The crops are resown every year. The animals get on. you know, this is the continuous creation of the world embodied in this God or anthropomorphized by this God. And this God, as an icon of nature, wouldn't necessarily be very attractive. He's depicted as having a beard, again, wild, having a pug nose, because so much of the animal kingdom isn't very aesthetic to us. And to the Greeks, he was comedically unappealing. So if we're going to take this lead, then we should note right away that this is a potential explanation for where the devil gets the beard. But why did Pan get roped into this of all the deities? And that's layered. It's easier to get rid of other gods than it was Pan. Many gods would be localized to the shrine, and even by loose observation of the Old Testament, there is plenty of encouragement of destroying ancient shrines and ancient temples through violence or through burning, so forth. But in the case of Pan, this is nature, and nature is everywhere. So you can't quite destroy all of nature, at least not in that day and age. But instead, you might get clever and wish to assimilate the idea of Pan. Instead of being able to attack this outright, we can make it ours. And that is going to be a big trope for Christianity. The weird bunny iconography of Easter, Santa Claus and elves somehow being Christian, so forth. So much assimilation will become necessary for the greater body of Christianity to develop. And this is a great potential instance of that. And this god, Pan, is especially fitting because now we've wanted to make the devil more grotesque. Pan is grotesque. We've also wanted to associate the devil with worldly things and that of which is outside of our understanding, and that's the wild. This deformity as well would certainly play the part of something that's abominable. So, in many ways, the god and all of his iconography was all too good of a package, a mythological package, for the convenience of Christianity's assimilation. But this also helps to tackle a cultural difference that was in need of shifting. The ancient Greek disposition towards embracing one's more authentic nature through, for instance, the Dionysian mysteries to give way to the ecstasies of life, to the Christian mind, most certainly needed to be done away with. Also, the sexual habits of the Greeks needed to be done away with. And accordingly, if they could demonize Pan, if they could demonize the goat, if they could wear this form, this would help to push that agenda out. So, in this way, the satyr, half goat, half man god, would become the true scapegoat in more ways than one. But this would have been done at least somewhat retrospectively. The Greeks had already long been converted before this depiction became in vogue. This is all happening roughly in the 11th century, and the Greeks were among the first to be converted in Christianity. So these things are not quite all done at once, if that makes sense. Also, with the aforementioned the devil being red characteristic, that has also not been concretized yet. Even the poet Chaucer would depict the devil as green as late as the 1400s, thus associating the vegetation with the devil, the wild with the devil. Even that still yet hadn't been made red. That wouldn't be done until much closer to the modern age. With all this ambiguity and hedging aside, we still have one big, more layered attribute to tend to, and that is the pitchfork. There are two rather convincing ways to tend to this one. We don't have to interpret this pitchfork right away as a trident. We could also interpret it as a winnowing fork. And there is sufficient reference in the Bible for this winnowing process. Quote, "He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn, but the chaff he will burn with unquestionable fire." Here we're giving a direct allegory for the separation of those who are worthy and those who are unworthy. And so to give the devil this winnowing fork is a kind of ironic nod to what he's doing. He's testing and separating those who are righteous and those who are unrighteous. So this reference could be thought of as directly biblical, but All too often, when we see the devil with his trident, he is using it toward magical effect, as though it is a magical staff of some kind. And in this case, it very much would seem to be a ripoff, yet again, a case of religious mythical assimilation. But this is more of a bastardization than anything. There isn't any straightforward reason why the devil would take Poseidon's staff, other than an idea introduced very early in Christianity, which is the doctrine of demonic imitations. And this is the case of how do we explain all of the ancient gods that we're trying to assimilate? How do we explain the miracles they performed, what they did, so forth? Well, it's easy. All of that was the devil. All of the gods, all that they did, all of the stories, it was all the devil. And accordingly, anything that the gods had, anything that the gods did, was of the devil, and the devil has access to those things. And so this bastardization, this use of Poseidon's staff, would be simply a nod to that was the devil the whole time, and thus he's going to use it in any way that he sees fit towards any magical aims. This could be thought of as simply an instance of mythological dumping, where it's all pagan, so we're just going to throw all of it in there and we're going to use whatever we feel like with absolutely no understanding of what the fundamental ideas behind those pagan symbols are. But it should also be pointed out how recognizable of a symbol this would have been in the attempts to proselytize the pagan people. This was a very common tool. Most people were agrarian. You show them the devil has this tool that they use, you tell them that the devil's evil, this makes them concerned. So this, yet again, is all up for interpretation, yet this is another part of it. While this overall deconstruction of the devil's appearance is pretty satiating, there's still the open question of how the devil's personality or persona has developed in the way that it has. We saw in the Bible simply that he is a tester. He is cunning, intelligent, and then at the end made to be especially sinister. These traits, how to depict the devil as a personality, will variate throughout time, will oscillate. At times we need him to be pure evil. At times we need him to look like a buffoon, somebody who stumbles upon himself, a klutz. And I want to concentrate on this first because it's very mythologically relevant, and that is the devil's ancestry with trickster deities. The devil is trying to trick. That's the selling point most often, is he's trying to fool people into taking the wrong path. This fool of a devil is a reoccurring motif to make him seem silly or just irreverently chaotic. This is a trope that goes all the way back into prehistory. We cannot trace how far back the trickster deity goes. This is a trope that would deserve its own session in earnest. But to name a few, the most recognizable to us would be the Norse Loki, who is reoccurringly causing issues for everybody that he's associated with, and even people that he's not associated with, and has a crucial part in bringing about the end of the world. Then Coyote, infamous among the natives as a collective, this trickster essence that brings about great things and causes great troubles, but would not be made to be purely evil, but is a trickster. And lastly, people might recognize Eris from Greek mythology, the one who started, incidentally, the Trojan War. This goddess of chaos who causes trouble for everybody for their own amusement. There is a reoccurring trope among trickster deities of gratification or of a compulsive attitude. But in this comes discovery, and in this comes incidental good and incidental bad. The trickster likes the game of it, has a lead that they want to follow. They are seeking a form of gratification. And one could earnestly argue that the original characterization of the devil in the Bible was inspired from such trickster deities. Regardless, though, this image, this motif, projects itself onto the devil, if not originally, then much later down his mythological drift. But of course, it is convenient at times for Christianity to depict the devil as foolish, as stupid, and silly. But of course, there's the other end of this where it's comedic. There is such a seriousness at times that can be projected onto the devil, especially by people as serious as Christians have tended to be. And so it's a good gag to make the devil seem silly for the sake of relieving the pressure that comes along with that lore. But anyhow, let's continue with our narrative. Although we have established the reasons for the devil's eventual ubiquitous appearance, that of the red goat man, this still isn't decided. It's in the mix of the Middle Ages, but there's still variance on this subject, and to entertain that, we should look briefly at Dante's Inferno. This is coming around 1300. Dante portrays the devil as this morbid, three-faced creature in the very bottom of hell, which is freezing cold. Because, again, that older understanding of the heavens being that of fire would make it so that the opposite would be cold, you see. So Dante is taking liberties here with how he's choosing to depict the devil. Also, his choice of making the devil this character is helping to solidify his cultural interpretation, which is that he is the ruler of hell. The Bible never states this, but the cultural influence will convince the status quo that the Bible does say this and that this is in fact canonical. Dante's depiction of the devil here is curious in that it's picking from some ancient inspirations, most notably that God, or that which is heavenly, is more immaterial and that of the spirit, and the devil is gross material. He is the matter of the world, the physical appearances of the world, and that which we should get as far away from as possible. This is inherently Gnostic in its loyalties. The grotesque and visceral nature of depicting the devil is to point out the gross materialism of the world and the evil therein. But even though such ideas are out there, even though this is one of the earnest inspirations for the devil, the Middle Ages will take a different hegemony. The idea of spiritual warfare, the idea of the ransom theory, which is to say that the devil won over Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and thus Jesus needed to die in order to release mankind from his clutches. This theory has been contested quite a bit because it gives the devil agency over God or Jesus, as though he has an omnipotent power equal to or greater than. And so, of course, it's contentious, but nonetheless, this sort of sentiment will plague the minds of the Middle Ages. And interestingly, even though this is an all-encompassing evil that encompasses all of the material world, this spiritual warfare, nonetheless, exorcisms are not being practiced as much as they used to. But that's because in their place comes the burning times, the witch trials and the executions roughly between the years of 1450 to 1750. Now, I've done a whole session on the Burning Times and all of its lasting cultural impacts that we still are influenced by to this day. But for our purpose, the devil here takes back his sexual association. He seduces women into becoming witches, seduces them into contracts with himself in order to instigate his taking over of this world even further. Depending on what brand of Christianity was being practiced, where would decide whether or not there would be a mass hysteria in relation to this subject. The Puritans, those of whom would be a substantial part of early colonialization of the Americas, were stark in their fear of witchcraft and the devil's doings. It's not to say that everybody agreed with the hegemony of this era. Martin Luther said that all these evils being done were because God permits it, still maintaining that agency of God over the devil. Whereas a notable amount of other writers would point out that the evil in this world isn't purely the doing of the devil, but it's also the doings of witches and ungodly men. This interestingly harkens all the way back to an inspiration from Zoroastrianism, and that is, if we do not do good, then we will not bring about the paradise that is promised. And if we do bad, then we will further the dystopia of this world, damning everything and everybody. So you can see the fervor in this mentality behind why we must get rid of the pagans, why we must be aggressive in order to stamp out this absolutely infectious evil that wills to swallow up the whole of the civilized world. In regards to the moving interpretation of the devil throughout time, this is certainly the peak of interpreting the devil as a purely sinister, maleficent, almost omnipotent power. It's not just that he could be anywhere, it's that he is everywhere, in all things, in all peoples that don't practice exactly the way that we practice, in all the parts of nature that are not how we will for it to be, in all of the unknowns that we don't wish to bear with. It is the devil. And this influence still survives in that global satanic conspiracy sort of mindedness, where the thought of the negativity of the world, the tragedy of the world, is in fact an orchestration of absolute nefariousness. As this mentality is relatively waning in this later part, we do have an interesting hint of the future. In 1667, Milton publishes the first version of Paradise Lost. This is a very notable development in the image of the devil. Here, he is being depicted as an anti hero. He's charismatic, confident, independent. These suavemente almost attributes about him. The story relatively makes it unclear on whether or not God is an unjust ruler. And so the devil becomes much more of a sympathetic character and becomes more humanized. This influence curiously starts to transition the devil towards a more literary character than a ontological, metaphysical menace. And you can certainly see how this depiction, this interpretation of the devil, survives well into modern media. Ultimately, the fervor of the burning times carried over from the Middle Ages gives way to the Enlightenment. As a rough figure, the Enlightenment is dated towards the later end of the 1600s to the early end of the 1800s. As a general growing sentiment, they wished to make this fervor more irrelevant, that this concept of the devil had become a matter of mania, confusion, a distortion of thought. And so, whatever could be done by intellectual figureheads to demythologize this figure would have been respectable. And in the midst of this greater enlightenment, we get the magnum opus of Goethe, Faust. This work's creation and influence is most notably propagated in the late 1700s. In this work, Satan is not called Satan, he's called Mephistopheles, which has a somewhat obscure etymology, but roughly it means destroyer and or liar. The main crux of this story is Faust making a deal with the devil. This harkens to that thought through the Middle Ages, but also is somewhat of an homage to the temptation of Christ in the Bible, where Jesus says no to the deal. Faust gives a kind of trick of a deal to the devil. And in this, it plays out. It is a commentary on existentialism, on the human condition. So here, the devil is not the focus, the devil is a means towards a greater contemplation. Almost comedically, you could say that this story is a story of the wizard versus the devil. But overall, the question of how to reframe the devil in the common cultural interpretation is being continuously refined. There are a number of scholars into the modern age that wish to discard the devil completely, others that just simply want to understand him as a representation of evil, others that would just see him as a representation of the fantasy of the Middle Ages, and even philosophers who would say, no, the devil, in fact, is very real, but he's more archetypal. He hungers for reality, and the willingness to possess people or to act through people is the desire to become a part of the world or to reach a degree of manifestation. But regardless of all this, you can get the sense that the narrative, the approach, and the understanding towards this cultural historical figure has fundamentally shifted. The absolute pluralization of the devil's meaning has shifted dramatically. It's fractaled out into all these variant forms into the modern age. Ronald Reagan called the USSR the evil empire, and a former leader of Iran called the United States the great Satan, for similar reasons that the devil was even made fully evil to serve a political purpose in Christianization, in conversion tactics, and fear mongering. This is still useful to the power structures that be. What are viewed to be occult circles can utilize the image of the devil as simply something of almost a satirical appeal in order to get under the skin of Christians, the devil representing liberation and embrace almost like Dionysian in its values, the devil being a sympathetic, almost charming character in your sitcom, the devil wishing to make a contract, this Hollywood like story where you sell your soul and you become a supermodel or a huge musician or a great actor. Or it's just this recognizable, spooky, like evil character that you can throw into your story however you feel like. In spite of this pluralization, this still very much lives in its more, let's just say, traditional interpretation. There has certainly been no shortage of hysterias that have broken out, whether in our parents' generation, in our grandparents' generation, or even in our generation. The devil being behind drug use, heavy metal, reading books about teen wizards, Pokemon, astrology, yoga. This way of interpreting has retained somewhat, but also there's the silly interpretation, there's the trickster interpretation, there's the non existent interpretation, there's the this is an earnest misunderstood character that in fact very much exists but is not understood in the way that is appropriate, the anti-hero persona. And for instance, in tarot, the devil is a sort of mental prison, how our habits make us think that we are trapped, when in fact, this is a cycle that we need to work through and to transcend. So, in this way, the devil is more of an archetypal circumstance, that of which at any point we can transcend. In reflection of all of this, it's worthy of pointing out that so much of what has been done with the devil is biblically unjustified. This is not about the Bible. This is a cultural mythological character that has taken on the utility that we will for it to take on. When the devil was supposed to be all pervasive and evil, there were power structures and political agendas that found that interpretation very convenient. There were eras early on in this history where people were trying to decide how they should interpret this by the book. This has long passed, and all of this has been done in the meantime. There is no great morale to this story of what ought to be done or what I think we should do with this character, so forth. It is just to point out that these cultural motifs, these cultural characters, are vessels for our choice of interpretation. And the only thing that decides how that era interpreted that character is consensus, our consensus on how this ought to be approached, or even if we should continue this trope into the future, or whether or not this should dissipate into the past and be one of those bygone, obscure deities that next to nobody has heard of. This is a continuous story of which we all are writing. So I think, at the very least, an intriguing question isn't what the devil is, it's what you think it ought to be. The Spiritual Studies course is an effort towards free public education on matters of spirituality, comparative religion, and comparative mythology. This session is in thanks to my Buy Me Coffee members and Buy Me Coffee supporters. If you wish to support the course, look to the Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below. Buying me a coffee can just simply buy me a book for further research. These little contributions mean a lot for little channels like this. Assisting the course assists this thorough, free, sober public education. Incentives for support are early access to these sessions, commentaries on each of these subjects, updates on the course, and your name at the end of the video, like that of which you're seeing. Stay curious. Keep wondering.